The desert does not just take your life. It tries to erase your memory, burying the evidence of your existence beneath a shifting shroud of heat and sand. On a jagged ridgeline in the Hindu Kush, the wreckage of an F-16 Fighting Falcon lay like a broken, scorched bird, its silver skin blackened by an inferno that had finally begun to settle into a low, rhythmic hiss of cooling metal. To anyone watching from the thermal lenses of a high-altitude drone, there was no sign of life, only the jagged debris field and the persistent glow of JP-8 fuel burning in the crevices of the rock. The recovery team, a specialized unit of Navy SEALs, had been sent in with a grim objective: secure the sensitive technology and recover the remains of Captain Maya Vance. They moved with the silent, predatory grace of men who had seen every horror war had to offer, their boots crunching on glass and carbon fiber. They expected silence, the heavy, suffocating silence of a grave. But as the lead operator knelt by the crumpled cockpit, he signaled for a total radio blackout. In the sudden, ringing quiet of the mountainside, he didn't hear the crackle of fire or the whistle of the wind. He heard a wet, rhythmic rasp, the sound of someone fighting for air through a crushed chest. Captain Vance was still there, pinned beneath 3 tons of burning fuselage, her body broken but her spirit refusing to yield. It raises a question that every one of us must eventually answer. When the world has already written you off and the fire is closing in, where do you find the strength to take that next breath? Does a warrior's true power lie in their skill, or in the refusal to let go when the light begins to fade? We want to hear your thoughts in the comments. Is resilience something we are born with, or is it forged in the moments when we are most alone? Captain Maya Vance was not a product of luck. She was a masterpiece of discipline, carved out of the quiet, unwavering expectations of a military household where excellence was the only acceptable baseline. Growing up as the daughter of a Marine Corps drill instructor, she learned early on that her worth was not defined by her gender or her words, but by the calluses on her hands and the unwavering focus in her eyes. While other girls her age were dreaming of fairy tales, Maya was in the garage, helping her father strip and reassemble engines, learning the mechanical language of machines that didn't care who was operating them as long as they were operated with precision. She carried this relentless drive into the Air Force Academy, where she quickly realized that being a woman in the cockpit of a fighter jet meant she would have to be twice as good just to be considered an equal. She didn't complain about the scrutiny. She used it as fuel. Every flight simulator session, every grueling physical training run, and every late-night study of tactical maneuvers was a brick in the fortress of her character. She developed a reputation for being the Ice Queen, not because she was cold, but because she possessed a terrifying level of composure under pressure. Her instructors noted that her heart rate barely shifted when she was put into high-G maneuvers or simulated emergency scenarios. To Maya, the cockpit wasn't just a workspace. It was a sanctuary where the noise of the world was replaced by the hum of the turbines and the clarity of a mission. She understood that leadership wasn't about shouting orders. It was about being the person everyone looked to when the situation turned to chaos. This discipline was rooted in a deep sense of service, a belief that her life was a tool to be used for the protection of those who couldn't protect themselves. She spent years honing her craft, learning the intricacies of the F-16, a machine that demanded total synchronicity between human and hardware. She wasn't just flying the plane, she was part of it. Her journey through the ranks was a testament to the fact that merit knows no boundaries if you are willing to outwork everyone in the room. By the time she was deployed to one of the most volatile regions in the world, Maya Vance had become a symbol of what it meant to be a modern warrior: resilient, highly skilled, and possessing a moral compass that pointed toward duty at all costs. She knew the risks of her profession, the reality that every takeoff carried the potential for a final landing. But she walked toward her jet with a sense of purpose that made fear seem like a distant, irrelevant concept. She believed that as long as she did her job with perfection, the universe would respect the effort. She was prepared for the dogfights, the surface-to-air missiles, and the tactical complexities of modern air combat. What she wasn't prepared for was the moment the machine she trusted would become the very thing that tried to claim her life, testing the limits of her discipline in a way that no simulator ever could. The deployment to the remote operating base was supposed to be the culmination of a decade of preparation, a chance for Maya to lead her wing in real-world sorties that mattered. The environment was harsh, a landscape of jagged peaks and deep valleys that swallowed radio signals and challenged even the most experienced pilots. In this high-altitude theater, the air was thin and the margins for error were non-existent. Maya's role as a flight lead meant she was responsible not just for her own aircraft, but for the lives of the pilots flying on her wing. She took this responsibility with a gravity that bordered on the sacred. Every morning before dawn, she would walk the flight line, her eyes scanning the airframes for any sign of wear, any loose bolt or leaking fluid that the maintenance crews might have missed. She spoke to the mechanics with a deep respect, understanding that her life was in their hands long before she ever throttled up for takeoff. This period of her life was an education in the true meaning of teamwork. In the military, you learn quickly that no hero stands alone. Every victory is the result of 1,000 small, correct decisions made by 100 different people. Maya leaned into this, fostering a culture of extreme accountability within her squadron. She taught her younger pilots that survival wasn't about ego. It was about humility and the willingness to learn from every mistake. During their long missions over the desert, she would often find herself staring out at the horizon, the curvature of the earth visible from her perch at 30,000 feet, feeling a profound sense of connection to the history of the warriors who had come before her. She was a woman in a male-dominated field, yes, but she refused to let that be her primary identity. She was a pilot first, a leader second, and a survivor always. Her resilience was tested daily by the grueling pace of operations, the lack of sleep, and the constant threat of enemy engagement. Yet, she found a strange kind of peace in the routine. There was a clarity to the mission that the civilian world often lacked. In the sky, things were binary. You were on target or you weren't. Your engine was running or it wasn't. You were alive or you were dead. This simplicity appealed to her nature. She thrived in the structured chaos of the war zone, her mind constantly calculating fuel rates, engagement zones, and egress routes. She was at the top of her game, a finely tuned instrument of national defense. But as any seasoned soldier knows, the moment you feel most in control is often the moment the ground starts to shift. The mission that would change everything started like any other, a routine reconnaissance overwatch for a ground convoy moving through a dangerous mountain pass. The weather was clear, the systems were green, and Captain Vance felt the familiar surge of adrenaline as she accelerated down the runway. She had no way of knowing that within 2 hours, the silver bird she loved would be a flaming wreck, and she would be forced to find a level of strength she didn't know she possessed. The incident occurred with a violent suddenness that defied the laws of probability. One moment, Maya was banking her F-16 through a high G turn, watching the dust trails of the convoy below, and the next, a catastrophic internal failure tore through the heart of her engine. It wasn't an enemy missile, it was a freak mechanical fracture, a tiny piece of metal inside the turbine that decided it had reached its breaking point. The cockpit erupted in a chorus of warning lights and the terrifying master caution chime that every pilot hears in their nightmares. The jet shuddered violently, losing thrust instantly as the engine began to eat itself. Maya's training kicked in immediately, her hands moving across the controls in a practiced blur as she tried to air start the failing motor. She went through the emergency checklist with a clinical detachment, her voice steady as she radioed her wingman to report the flameout. "I have no relight," she stated, her mind already calculating her glide ratio. She was over some of the most unforgiving terrain on the planet, a labyrinth of rock and shadow where a forced landing was suicide. Her first instinct was to steer the dying aircraft away from the friendly convoy and a nearby village, prioritizing the lives on the ground over her own chance at a clean ejection. She stayed with the plane too long, fighting the heavy, unresponsive controls as the hydraulics began to fail. The mountain face loomed in her canopy, a wall of gray stone that seemed to rush toward her with predatory speed. She pulled the ejection handle just as the right wing clipped a jagged outcropping. The sequence initiated, but the aircraft's violent roll and the proximity to the slope meant the ejection seat didn't clear the wreckage cleanly. Instead of being launched into the sky, Maya was still partially entangled with the airframe as it impacted the ridge. The sound was like the world being torn in half, a deafening roar of grinding metal and exploding fuel. The F-16 didn't just crash, it disintegrated, tumbling along the ridgeline in a cascade of fire and debris. Maya was conscious for the first few seconds of the impact, feeling the bone-shattering force of the deceleration before a heavy section of the fuselage collapsed inward, pinning her against the rocky earth. Then, the world went black. She was left in a tomb of fire and twisted aluminum, her body broken and her oxygen mask torn away, while the fuel from the ruptured tanks began to pool around the wreckage. To any observer, the crash was unsurvivable. Her wingman, circling above in a frantic search for a parachute, saw only a crater of flame and smoke. He called in the coordinates, his voice thick with emotion, reporting that there were no signs of life. The military machine began to move, but not for a rescue. They were preparing for a recovery, sending in the SEALs to ensure that the sensitive electronics didn't fall into the wrong hands, and to bring home what they assumed would be a fallen hero. Darkness wasn't just the absence of light for Maya. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that smelled of chemicals and burnt rubber. When she finally drifted back to consciousness, she didn't feel pain at first. She felt a strange, cold pressure. She tried to move her legs, but they were immovable, buried under a mass of metal that felt like it was part of the earth itself. Slowly, the sensory details of her reality began to pierce through the shock. The heat was the first thing she noticed, a searing, pulsing radiation from the burning engine only yards away. Then came the smell of JP-8 fuel, thick and sickly sweet, coating her flight suit and making every breath a struggle. Her left arm was shattered, hanging at an angle that her brain refused to process, and her chest felt as though it had been flattened by a hammer. Every shallow breath she took felt like glass shards moving through her lungs. This was the moment where most people would have succumbed to the panic, the primal urge to scream until the air ran out. But Maya Vance was a product of SEER training, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. She closed her eyes and forced herself to focus on a single, internal point of light. She didn't think about the miles of desert between her and safety, or the fact that she was half crushed under a burning jet. She thought only about the next 30 seconds. Breathe in, breathe out, stay awake. She knew that if she fell asleep now, she would never wake up. The fire was creeping closer, dancing along the fuel lines, and she could hear the groan of the wreckage as it settled further into the soft sand. She began to use her one functional hand to tap against a piece of the fuselage, a rhythmic, intentional sound that cut through the chaotic hiss of the flames. It was a message to the universe. I am still here. The psychological battle was more intense than the physical pain. She found herself hallucinating, seeing her father's face in the smoke, hearing the voices of her squadron mates. She had to fight to stay grounded in the reality of the ridge. She remembered the lessons of leadership she had taught her pilots, that a leader's first duty is to keep their head when everyone else is losing theirs. She applied that to herself. She became her own commanding officer, giving herself internal orders to stay conscious, to keep tapping, to keep fighting. She was a woman who had spent her life proving her strength, and now, in the ultimate test of that strength, she refused to let the desert claim her without a fight. The hours bled into each other. The sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows over the wreckage, and the temperature began to plummet, creating a cruel contrast between the freezing mountain air and the heat of the fire. Her body was going into shock, her pulse slowing as her internal systems began to shut down to protect her core. But the tapping continued. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a ghostly sound against the vast silence of the Hindu Kush. She was waiting for a miracle she had no reason to expect, her life hanging by a thread of pure, unadulterated will. The SEAL team arrived under the cover of a moonless night, their NVGs turning the world into a haunting shade of emerald green. They moved with a clinical efficiency, their weapons at the ready, expecting to find a debris field and a body. Master Chief Miller, a veteran of 2 decades of special operations, led the way. He had seen dozens of crash sites, and he knew the look of death. It was usually messy, loud, and final. As they approached the main section of the fuselage, The air was still thick with the acrid stench of the fire. The medic, a soft-spoken operator named Elias, was the first to stop. He raised a hand, signaling the team to halt. He tilted his head, his ears straining against the silence. "Chief," he whispered into the comms, "I've got rhythmic metal on metal." Coming from under the wing section, Miller moved forward, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way it hadn't in years. They reached the crumpled cockpit area, and there, amidst the blackened ruins and the flickering embers, they saw a hand. It was pale, covered in soot and blood, and it was weakly but deliberately striking a piece of the airframe with a jagged shard of plexiglass. "She's alive," Elias shouted, breaking the tactical silence as he scrambled toward the wreckage. What followed was a feat of engineering and raw physical strength that redefined the word teamwork. The SEALs realized that Maya was pinned in a way that made a simple extraction impossible. The fuselage was unstable. If they moved the wrong piece, the whole structure would collapse, crushing what was left of her. They worked in the shadows of a mountain that seemed to want her dead, using hydraulic jacks and their own backs to lift the heavy metal just inches at a time. The fuel was still leaking, a ticking time bomb that threatened to turn the entire site into a fireball at any moment. Elias crawled into the tight space beside Maya, his voice a steady, calming presence in her ear. "Captain, I'm Elias. We've got you. You're not going anywhere but home." Maya couldn't speak, her throat scorched by the smoke, but she gripped his hand with a strength that surprised him. It was the grip of someone who had looked into the abyss and told it to move aside. For 3 hours, the SEALs fought the mountain. They moved tons of steel with surgical precision, their sweat mixing with the grit of the crash site. When they finally pulled her free, the wreckage groaned and collapsed into the space she had just occupied. They carried her to the extraction point as the sun began to peek over the horizon, a broken warrior shielded by the arms of men who had been sent to bury her but stayed to save her. As the medevac chopper banked away from the ridge, Miller looked down at the site and then at the pale woman fighting for air on the litter. He realized he had just witnessed the highest form of military value, not the destruction of an enemy, but the refusal of a comrade to give up on life. The recovery was a long, agonizing journey that took Maya Vance through the darkest corridors of the human experience. She spent months in intensive care, undergoing dozens of surgeries to rebuild her shattered limbs and graft the skin that the fire had tried to take. There were days when the pain was so intense that she questioned why she had fought so hard to stay alive on that ridge. The Ice Queen was gone, replaced by a woman who had to learn how to walk again, how to hold a fork, and how to live with the haunting memories of the fire. But the discipline she had cultivated in the cockpit didn't abandon her in the hospital. She approached her physical therapy with the same relentless focus she had once given to flight school. Every agonizing step with her prosthetic leg was a mission. Every rep in the gym was a tactical maneuver toward independence. She realized that her identity wasn't tied to the jet she flew, but to the resilience that allowed her to survive its loss. She began to speak to other wounded veterans, sharing her story not as a tale of victimhood, but as a lesson in the power of the human spirit. She taught them that leadership doesn't end when the uniform comes off. It evolves into the responsibility to inspire others through your own recovery. Her story became a beacon within the military community, a reminder that the bond between service members is a sacred contract that transcends the battlefield. She eventually returned to the Air Force, not as a combat pilot, but as an instructor and a strategist, using her experience to train the next generation of aviators in the realities of survival and the importance of mental fortitude. She often thought back to the tapping sound she made against the fuselage, that small, defiant act of communication. It taught her that even in our most isolated moments, we have the power to reach out, to signal our presence, and to demand to be heard. She learned that true courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision that something else is more important than that fear. For Maya, that something else was the duty to return home to the people who loved her and the responsibility to honor the men who had risked everything to pull her from the wreckage. Her life became a living testament to the military values of honor, courage, and commitment, proving that while a jet can be crushed, the heart of a warrior is indestructible. She walked with a slight limp and carried scars that would never fade, but she walked with a grace and a purpose that few people ever truly achieve. She had been tested by fire and found to be tempered, not broken. The story of Captain Maya Vance is more than a chronicle of a miracle rescue. It is a profound reflection on the hidden reserves of strength that lie within us all. It reminds us that the human spirit is a force that cannot be measured by G-force or calculated by flight computers. Maya didn't survive because she was lucky. She survived because she had spent a lifetime building a foundation of discipline, purpose, and an unshakable belief in her own agency. Her experience under that burning jet represents the ultimate collision between the fragility of the body and the indomitability of the soul. It teaches us that in our darkest hours, when we are pinned down by the weight of our own crashes, whether they be physical, emotional, or professional, the most important thing we can do is keep tapping. We must keep signaling our presence, keep taking the next breath, and refuse to let the silence win. Maya's journey is a tribute to the men and women in uniform who live by the code of never leaving a fallen comrade, but it is also a call to action for every one of us. It challenges us to ask ourselves, what are we building today that will sustain us when our own fires start to burn? Her story is a reminder that resilience is a muscle, forged through daily acts of courage and the quiet choice to never, ever give up. As we look at the scars she carries and the life she rebuilt, we are inspired to believe that no matter how deep the debris field, there is always a path back to the light for those who have the heart to find it. Let her legacy be a reminder that you are stronger than the things that try to crush you. And as long as you are breathing, the mission isn't over. Keep fighting, keep leading, and never stop reaching for the sky.